Walk into the basement of almost any commercial building that still stands from before 1860 in St. Louis, Cincinnati, or Chicago, and ignore the pipes, the storage racks, and the machinery that were added later, because the detail that matters is usually hidden lower, built into the original foundation itself, a sealed brick arch, perfectly curved, carefully keystoned, and covered over so neatly that it looks less like a repair and more like something someone wanted erased without drawing attention to it. If you ask the city planning office, they will tell you it was an old coal chute. If you ask an architectural historian, they'll call it load-bearing relief. But if you were to take a sledgehammer and break through that secondary layer of brick, you wouldn't find compacted Midwestern dirt. You would find a vaulted, cathedral-style tunnel. And that tunnel doesn't just go out to the street, it goes to the next grid, to the next city. We are told the 19th century pioneers built the American Midwest from scratch. They didn't. We just moved into the attic. I didn't start out looking for lost empires. I was looking at municipal water management records from the 1880s for a completely different project. It's dry work. You spend hours in poorly lit county archives, smelling of decaying binding glue and stale dust. But after the fourth or fifth city blueprint, a discrepancy starts to bother you. The sewer systems in these cities, the deep vaulted brick drains, they predate the populations that supposedly built them. The official records claim we dug deep trenches, laid millions of precisely fired bricks in perfect subterranean arches, and then paved over them, all while the towns above were still struggling with unpaved mud streets and cholera. It doesn't make logistical sense. The infrastructure below ground is vastly superior to the original structures above it. It looks exactly like the top layer of something much deeper. I kept trying to find the original excavation orders, the actual purchase receipts for the digging. They don't exist. What does exist are the surveyor's notes from right after the winter of 1811. If you know your geography, you know 1811, December 16th. 2:15 in the morning. The New Madrid Earthquake. The textbooks treat it as a freak tectonic anomaly, a mid-continent fault line slipping. But if you actually sit down and read the primary source diaries, the letters written by the river merchants and the trappers who were there, the descriptions do not match a tectonic event. Geological fault slippage is a grinding, lateral violence. It has a specific physical signature. The people in the Mississippi Valley that night recorded something else entirely. They described deafening subterranean thunder, a roar coming from directly beneath their boots, followed by the ground giving way entirely. The earth opened up and swallowed whole groves of trees, dragging them straight down into the dark. The Mississippi River famously ran backwards for hours. You only get that kind of localized, catastrophic displacement if the riverbed suddenly loses its structural integrity and collapses into a massive void beneath it. The earth didn't shake, it fell inward. Imagine standing in the dark, the smell of sulfur and ancient stagnant water rushing up from fissures in the frozen mud. The ground simply gave way. The roof of a continent-wide subterranean network was failing under its own weight, or under something else. When the dust settled over the next few months, the surviving surveyors and naturalists went out to map the damage. This is where the archival boxes get heavy. This is where I found myself reading the same cursive paragraphs 3 or 4 times, waiting for my brain to process the ink. Because the fissures didn't just expose bedrock, they exposed passages. Exposed ravines revealed walls of smooth, polished stone that defied 18th century masonry. Corridors running horizontally into the bluffs, completely level, branching off into the dark. But the architecture isn't what made me stop taking notes. It was the cleanup reports. The biological debris pulled from the collapsed chambers. In the rubble of these subterranean vaults, the survey teams documented bones. These were humanoid remains crushed under the weight of falling masonry. Their dimensions violate everything we understand about human anatomy. I found a medical report from a federal survey team working south of St. Louis. The lead physician documented intact femurs pulled from the broken brickwork. He recorded the length of the most complete specimen, 31 inches. A standard adult male femur is maybe 18 inches long. You scale up a 31-inch femur and you are looking at a bipedal structure standing over 9 feet tall. The skulls pulled from the same debris fields had unusually thick frontal plates and double rows of teeth. These weren't anomalies or glandular disorders. This was a distinct biological reality. Measurements of an impossible scale. They were pulling the original architects out of the wreckage. If you find a shattered, impossible civilization beneath the jungle canopy, you excavate it. You put it in a museum. But if you find it directly beneath the territory your young nation is actively trying to settle, you hide it. You don't leave a 100-mile-long collapsed tunnel system open to the sky. You fill the void. Walk down the street in the historic district of any major Midwestern city. Look down at the pavement. You'll see those weird half-moon windows sitting exactly at street level, looking down into the basements of 19th century buildings. We barely process them anymore. We assume they were built that way for ventilation, to let a little light into the cellar. But look closer at the brickwork around those glass panes. Trace the vertical lines. They don't frame a window, they frame a door. A 10-foot vaulted archway door submerged in dirt, paved over with cobblestone and asphalt. The ground floor of those buildings is underground. The street level wasn't naturally braided. It was raised, artificially, hastily, and by several feet of compacted earth. People talk about the mudflood as if it were a slow climatological mystery, rain and sediment building up over centuries. That doesn't happen to a functioning city. Dirt burying the first floors of 18th century masonry wasn't weather, it was mortar. It was a panicked, heavily organized effort to seal the surface, to cover the exposed skylights and cracked vaults of the subterranean network that had suddenly violently caved in. They poured the earth over the ruins, leveled it out, and built their wooden storefronts on top of the old roofs. We just moved into the attic. And if the burial was intentional, it required an organized labor force. It required a map. I spent a few weeks in the late winter tracking down the aerial geometry of these early settlements. You start staring at microfilm screens until your eyes dry out and the fluorescent glare gives you a migraine. But the pattern forces you to keep going. Because the collapses weren't random. Look at the maps drawn immediately before 1820. Look at the fortifications scattered across the American interior, the star forts, the old masonry redoubts with perfect geometric angles that sit on the coastlines and the river bends. We are taught that early colonial militias built them to fend off cannons, but the geometry of a star fort is incredibly complex. It requires advanced mathematics, heavy stone cutting, and a massive supply chain. Militiamen living in log cabins did not possess the industrial capacity to build them from scratch in the wilderness, because they didn't build them, they found them. And if you overlay the 1811 earthquake fissure maps with the locations of these forts, the lines connect. The forts sit exactly at the nodes of the collapsed subterranean grid. They were access points, terminals. The layout across the continent is too perfectly aligned to be regional. We are looking at a single interconnected machine stretching from the Great Lakes to the Gulf. Measurements of an impossible scale. But the most terrifying part of the New Madrid collapse isn't what fell into the earth. It's who was sent to clean it up. I kept coming back to the timeline, and I'm not entirely sure why it took me so long to see it. Or maybe my brain just didn't want to accept the math of it. The ground splits open in the winter of 1811. It exposes thousands of miles of impossible architecture and the biological remains of the people who engineered it. Just months later, the War of 1812 begins. Suddenly, federal troops are dispatched in massive numbers. But look at the deployment orders in the National Archives. Entire regiments are sent not to the Canadian border, not to the coastlines to repel the British Navy, but straight into the American interior. They are sent to set up blockades along the shattered Mississippi and Ohio river valleys. The official record says they were securing the frontier, but there were no British there. The military wasn't securing a border, they were establishing an exclusion zone. Let me propose something that sounds absurd until you examine the evidence. What if wars are sometimes just operational cover for historical resets? It would explain why thousands of federal soldiers were stationed in empty, decimated wilderness instead of active combat zones. It would explain how the federal government possessed the manpower to instantly quarantine an area the size of Western Europe. It would explain the sudden coordinated effort to dump millions of tons of earth into the fissures, burying the exposed archways, the smooth stone corridors, and the 31-inch femurs under a layer of compacted dirt and official silence. The military controlled the perimeter. The early surveyors mapped the damage, and then the institutional memory simply vanished. The Smithsonian was established a few decades later, and their early mandates explicitly focused on the collection and categorization of mound builder artifacts from this exact region. Whatever couldn't be buried was confiscated. Whatever was too big to fit the timeline of simple, primitive tribes was put into boxes and quietly moved into off-site storage. An apocalyptic structural collapse exposes the buried skeleton of the old world. A war is immediately declared. The military locks down the impact zone. The earth is moved. The doors are bricked over. The history books are printed. Just an eerie coincidence. But the silence in the record isn't a passive void. You have to understand how archives work to see the shape of the redaction. I sat in a reading room in St. Louis for 3 days, going through the digitized land grants of the early 1820s. When a government maps a new territory, it catalogues everything: resources, hazards, existing structures. The early French and Spanish maps of the region label specific coordinates as ancient cities or ruins. The very first American maps do the same. Then something happens in the record. The references stop, abruptly. Sometime in the decade after the New Madrid collapse, the cartographic terminology shifts entirely. An ancient city becomes an Indian mound. A complex subterranean brick-lined chamber is relabeled as a natural cave formation. I requested the Federal Survey logs for the lower Mississippi Valley from 1815 to 1825. The index lists 72 separate survey boxes for that district. But if you try to pull them, 30 of them are marked missing or destroyed by fire. The ones that remain are heavily redacted or strangely vague about topography that earlier explorers described in intricate, awestruck detail. It's not rhetorical, it's physical data. The window in the record closed as if someone had drawn a curtain. And if you trace that silence forward, it doesn't stop in the 19th century. The quarantine of 1812 was just the first phase. The final phase was an act of civil engineering so massive we still revere it as a triumph of modern progress. Look at the Ozarks. Look at the massive, sprawling network of man-made lakes created by the Army Corps of Engineers throughout the 20th century. The official reason for flooding these deep, ancient river valleys was flood control and hydroelectric power.
They displaced thousands of people, buried entire towns, and submerged millions of acres of old-growth forest under hundreds of feet of water. But if you look at the geological surveys taken before the dams were built, those specific valleys in Missouri and Arkansas were riddled with massive, unexplained sinkholes and deep horizontal cave systems that didn't behave like natural limestone karst. They looked like the collapsed, unsealed access points to a subterranean network, the ones that didn't fully cave in during the 1811 event. We didn't build lakes. We poured liquid concrete to drown the entrances. The earth didn't shake, it fell inward, and what didn't fall inward was deliberately submerged. The Army Corps of Engineers finished filling the Ozark valleys by the mid-20th century. The Smithsonian's early records are permanently classified or lost to convenient fires. The narrative has been set in stone. But stone is heavy, and what lies beneath it is hollow. Next time you are standing in the basement of an old commercial building in the Midwest or walking over a cast-iron storm grate in the street, pay attention to the vibration when a heavy truck drives by. Pay attention to the deep, low resonance traveling up through your shoes. They'll tell you it's just the city infrastructure, a subway line, or a fault line settling in the bedrock. But fault lines don't echo, and dirt doesn't hum. You aren't feeling the earth settle. You are feeling the acoustic vibration of a 100-mile vaulted brick chamber waiting silently in the dark. We didn't build the foundation of this world. We just moved into the attic. The archives are deep, and this is only one file. If you want to see what else they buried, join me.